sponsored by the IC Square Institute, and I would like to take this opportunity and thank the director Robert Peterson and the associate director David Gibson for making it possible. And in fact, Margaret Copperfield helped us with preparing the book for print, and I would like to also acknowledge her invaluable assistance in making the project. So, continuing with what Professor said, I would like to put my own part and adding to the story. So I was at that time in the ILO when I have been working with the Moscow office looking at impact of Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization, where I had to try to find what are the methodologies that one can use to assess the impact of countries accessing the WTO. Upon my return to Geneva, I was requested to look at how globalization influences decent work. And as mentioned by the professor, both globalization and decent work are multidimensional phenomenon. So what were in need of trying to come up with a framework. My supervisor back then, Peter Peake, approached me to say, Ruzanna, you know, I have this huge database. There is an immense information here, but we do not have any framework or methodology how we can help it. And at that point, the methodology, he had a data of doing business from the World Bank. It was 2005, so it was new. Trying to see how policies will influence development was so important that for him, that was an exciting database one could manipulate and try to make simulations. So this is where we start applying for the first time and trying to see how the policy variables and performance variables can be put into one framework. And then, one important thing that I would like to mention here, given the information analysis that went into book and the format of today's presentation, it was impossible for us to communicate with the methodology and data analysis. However, what I could manage was, in this particular exercise we have used the frontier analysis. This is a specialized software. What I could negotiate and agreed was that the software company designed a demonstrative version of their software using the data which has been analyzed in the book. That demonstrative version is available online, and those who are interested, they can download and see how the data analysis is working. And that will give you an insight precisely what type of data, what the analysis allows you to do and manipulate. Perhaps the only thing I would like to add here is that the data envelope analysis provides what is called Pareto-Kopman efficient solutions. And I would like to read how this is defined. Efficiency is achieved if and only if it is not possible to improve any input or output without worsening some other input or outputs. And inefficiency is present when it is possible to improve some input or output without worsening some other input and output. So in the House, here in the WTO, the decision makers are trying to forge a consensus. And the entire notion of the consensus is built how the solutions which are agreed do not take at the cost of the negotiating party. So what we believe, in fact, is data envelopment analysis is providing an analytical framework that can be used by decision makers to forge a consensus by the very fact of a notion of Pareto-Kopman efficiency, because the optimal solution derived by the model, in fact, are providing empirical guidance for decision makers. But as noted by Kopman in his Nobel lecture in 1975, the Economist as such doesn't advocate criteria of optimality. He may invent them, he may discuss their pros and cons, but ultimate choice is made by the procedure of decision-making inherent in the institutions, laws, and customs of the society. The extent that the economist takes part in this decisive phase, he does this in a double role as an economist and as a citizen of his polity, local polity, national polity, or world polity. So what we have got here is, in fact, is that the research in itself is only a part of a process, decision-making process. And the rest is a process of negotiation, political judgment, etc. And as Professor Thore mentioned in preface to the book, this book examines the promise in the regards of what the data envelopment can offer, and this is documented in a 20 years period of application of the data envelopment analysis. And I have distributed for you the update of the IC Square Institute, where they present the achievements in this field. And as Professor mentioned, I have created the Geneva Consensus Foundation that in fact will be engaged in a practical application of the research which we have been put in the book. So I would like to finish here and give an opportunity to the discussants that will present to you their views overall about the book, how they see the use of the book in the upcoming 2050 agenda, which has just been negotiated in New York. And I think in that respect we have been privileged, as the WTO Public Forum is perhaps the first international event right after the General Assembly, which took place later last week. So I would like to request from Marion? Jansen, no? Jansen? Yeah, because here we have this pronunciation delicacy. So I would like to request Marion Jansen. I would request her to present her background, because she has a very special professional background related to the book, as she used to work for the WTO, also with the ILO, and now in the International Trade Center. But I will better for her to present the details of her engagement related to globalization, employment, decent work, and how she views the book will contribute to those endeavors. Marion.
Thank you, Ruzanna. I will not try to pronounce your family name. Thanks for this introduction, and thanks for having given me the opportunity to be here today, and to have given me the opportunity to read this book that I received in advance of this meeting today. Indeed, the book is relevant to work I've done in the past, and I hope it will be relevant for work I will be doing in the future. I will, working now for ITC, be very interested in seeing the business level applications of this methodology, because we are very much working at that level. But my comments today will be about the book and about how it fits, I think, in current theoretical, academic, but also policy discussions. I'm looking at this book indeed from the background that Ruzanna mentioned. I have worked for many years at the WTO in the research department, where I was a colleague of Hubert. I worked for 4 years at the ILO and did not overlap with Ruzanna. She just left when I joined. And Anne was there responsible for work on the theme trade and employment, or also larger globalization and employment. And now recently joined ITC, where we are working a lot on small and medium-sized enterprises and analyzing and also implementing work in order for them to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. This book is very timely, and I think you're aware of this. There has been a conclusion on the Sustainable Development Goals, on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And what you present here is a way of assessing whether in 2030 we will have managed to do what we want to do. So very timely, and I expect that many people will be looking at this methodology to see how, whether and how they can use it. The book is also timely for another reason. It contains a lot of interesting discussions about how economic theory and application of economic theory has evolved over the past decades, really, and how this evolution relates to the current discussions we have on globalization and on a fair globalization. And that's interesting and also timely again. Timely because I think we're living in a period where we are questioning certainly things that we thought were truths for many years. Now we are asking ourselves, maybe these were just beliefs and maybe it's time to change our way of looking at things. It is also good in general, I think, to always take a look from a certain perspective at the way we are doing our business. So seeing how the economists that you refer to, that Professor Thore referred to, have been analyzing similar questions in the past is very useful and should guide also young professionals. So the book contains this information about how to assess whether, how we could possibly think about assessing whether sustainable development goals are being reached. It contains a discussion about how economic thinking has evolved that is relevant for these kind of questions. It also contains interesting policy discussions. Here there's a nice overview of policy initiatives, global policy debates, decisions that are relevant for the theme globalization and in particular fair globalization. So this relatively thin book contains an awful lot of things and it has been written in an amazingly accessible way. Now, after having listened to Professor Thore, I understand where that may come from, because I find that also he presents complex issues in a very accessible way. So this book is also accessible. It contains a lot of interesting information. I think if you're not necessarily a specialist, if you do not necessarily have an awful lot of time to go through all the details. That being said, that there are 3 comments, 3 issues, 3 questions, 3 types of questions I would like to raise and to put into this debate, maybe also for Hubert. While the envelope theory, the methodology you apply, it provides an interesting way of looking at how policy inputs can achieve policy objectives. You also always need to measure the objectives and also the policy you are applying. And my sense is that we are still very far behind on what we need to do on the measurement of these type of variables. It is my sense that a concept like decent work, that we still do not really know what does this entail. If you do not know what it entails and how to measure it, then it will remain difficult to apply your theory. Aspects like dignity are mentioned in the report, in your book, very relevant concepts. How are we ever going to measure these kind of concepts? I think that's a huge challenge we have been having for years and we continue to have, and further thinking, further data collection is needed there. My second and third point are related. They are related to economic thinking, how it evolves, and how it feeds into policy. You mention themes in the book that have, you say, not been treated well in mainstream economics, in neoclassical economics, path dependency, multiple equilibria, chaos. Yet it is my sense, and I come from a totally mainstream background, that these themes have always been analyzed, also by mainstream economists. That these were issues we were aware of, but they were never at the forefront of the discussions. We knew them, but we didn't focus on them. And actually, some of these issues have in very recent years been looked into in very mainstream organizations like the IMF. They've done a very interesting research on how inequality may have contributed to triggering the financial crisis through a multiple equilibrium approach. So these notions, these concepts have existed in the traditional, in the mainstream economic thinking in the past 20 years, but they were always like the exceptions to things that happen at the margin and that we do not need to focus on. And that leads to my third question, which is one of what determines whether what happens at the margin will become the focus? What determines whether there is a shift of attention in research, maybe a paradigm shift? How do these things occur? I think the period we are currently living in is a period where a lot of activity is happening at the margins, a lot of thinking, rethinking, questioning is happening, but where we do not know yet where the thinking is moving towards. And I'm wondering what will determine what the next idea is, what the next focus area will be, whether the next focus will be of our work in this area. Because that will partly also determine what will be picked up by policymakers. And the last question there, I would like to get Hubert's views on this, that's maybe yours. One question I have is whether it's researchers who will decide whether we suddenly focus on something else and therefore then influence policy making, or whether it's the policymakers who will be guiding us to where our academic thinking has to go. And with these questions on measurement and on changes in focus in our research and how it influences in policy, I will pass the microphone to Hubert, and I hope to get answers to my questions from Hubert or from Ruzanna.
Thank you very much, and I pass it to Hubert.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I'm able to provide the answer, but I was asked to introduce myself. I will do that in line of the subject of the book, which is a book which is difficult to present in WTO. It's a lawyers' organization, and the book is about applied mathematics. It's my background, so we are in the same boat, feeling a bit lonely in WTO, but I'm here in WTO as the chief statistician. But perhaps more relevantly, I participated in two aspects that are discussed in this book. First, I'm part of the community of people working on Millennium Development Goals indicators and monitoring, and now on Sustainable Development Goal definition and monitoring. It's part of my institutional work, and I was part of the discussion before when I worked in the United Nations. Second, because I was privileged for being invited to participate in a discussion on the Beyond GDP discussion, which was created by OECD and the European Community after the Sarkozy report you mentioned in your book. And I participated in this debate about, is GDP a good indicator of progress, what are alternative indicators, etc. So I was excited when I was invited to read the book first, which is a very interesting book, and comment addition. It's a very relevant book because it comes really at the right time. You know, we are discussing the Sustainable Development Goals in United Nations, but also in this house, in the WTO and many other parts. And the discussion is, today is not clear. It's what are those goals, what are they for, and it's closely linked to part 2 of the book, on Beyond GDP, and what are the real dimensions of welfare. Can we measure happiness? I won't answer your question on that, because I personally believe it's not measurable, and what is happiness for somebody will not be happiness for another one. So we have the famous aggregation issue, and somebody won a Nobel Prize showing that it's not possible to have a good aggregation of individual preferences. But what is also important in the book, and it's treated through the data envelopment analysis, can we go beyond the pure monetary approach of development? And the answer is yes. And I guess this is one of the important part of this book. The other one is the discussion on the indicators for monitoring the progress. And this debate, and you mentioned it, Marion, too, what are the indicators of results, and what are the indicators of policies, of instruments? And I I want to say that today, unfortunately, in the present discussion on sustainable development goals, it is not clear. A lot of experts put everything on the table. Indicators of goals that are achievements, indicators of goals which are more policies. And it's a bit frustrating for me to participate in this debate. I would say that the Millennium Development Goals were perhaps more structured because they were basically on policies, on instruments, with a few exceptions like poverty, which is more a result. And it's true that we can take governments accountable on the policies. We can take governments accountable on the use of instruments. But the achievements are often beyond their control because, as you mentioned in your book, you have a chaotic pattern in the world and things happen that are not under our control. We statisticians call them black swans, things that you don't think before. And as Marion said, we know they exist, but we don't know how to put them into a model. So this distinction today is present in the Sustainable Development Goals, and I hope the statistical community by the end of December will be able to sort out that. It's a hope, I doubt it. What is important in the book is the linkage you do between the variables that are instruments and those that are results. And the linkage, you do that through the technique of data envelopment analysis. I really found it interesting. I mean, this move from the causality, from understanding, and here the reference to Tinbergen, I mean, is important. The move from understanding economics, something that most of our young economists do today. I mean, they love understanding, etc. But in Tinbergen wanted to go further, move from understanding to praxis, to change the world. And perhaps it was because at that time people had more hope than technicians could change the world. And it was the time of planning. Both in the socialist economies, you had central planning, but in capitalist economies, you had also this kind of planning. It was called Keynesian economics, welfare state, but they had this strong feeling that it was possible to change the world. I'm not sure today, at least economists share the same hope or are even interested in changing the world. They are basically interested in understanding it better. And the book presents interesting example of the causality chain. I mean, I just take some, page 72, I saw figure 6.1, on the MDG goals, figure 6.2 on decent ILO decent work. I mean, how you can link instruments to results. I guess it's important. And where the fits in that, it's at the difference of Tinbergen work on econometric model. You have an econometric model, you put the variable and you think you can fine-tune the result. DER is less ambitious on one side, but perhaps more useful, in the sense that it doesn't try to put the causality in an equation, but it benchmarks the different actors and allows you to see where countries or firms stand compared to others. So it's exploratory, more than normative. And I want to say, in our work, where things are not that precise, that pure mathematics, it's perhaps more important to have this exploration than to have precise equations. Sorry, Marion, I know you're part of the... Or you were part. You were part of this brainstorm. So, I guess this is really important. So I will conclude on how this book could bring in the present discussion of the monitoring of the SDGs. First, I will say, clarifying more what are instruments and what are achievements. And I guess we still have a lot to do in this. Second, and here I may perhaps diverge from one of your objectives, which is to monitor what governments are doing and to rank them. I truly think that, first on practical thing, governments cannot be held totally accountable of the results. They can be accountable for putting in place the policy. But for the chaotic nature of the world, I mean, the right policy may not always reach the desired result. So you may not have to put them under the spotlight and name and shame through that. Nevertheless, I guess it would be very interesting to provide governments on information about the effectiveness of their policies, so that they could act on it. I don't want to enter into technical debates about frontier and meta-frontier, but I also think you should not put all the governments, all the countries into the same panel, in the sense that according to your background, your cultural history, etc., almost by definition, applying the same instrument will not reach the same result. So this concept of meta-frontier is perhaps more adequate, but it's not the place to discuss techniques. And finally, I guess, yes, this technique is important and should be used by donor agencies or international organizations which are active in the field in order to benchmark their own programs. And this will be perhaps more politically feasible because it's difficult to benchmark government's policy. Believe me, we work in WTO and we know, and we should not do that. But for a donor agency, being able to use this technology to benchmark the use, and ITC, you're involved in project management, etc. Being able to see in your project what are the most effective in reaching the target and why, and trying to apply the lesson to improve on others. And thank you very much for the opportunity.
I thank you both for your very constructive and useful comments. And I will definitely, have in mind that in my future research, if I will have an opportunity how to expand it. What I will agree with Hubert is definitely one of the advantages of data envelopment analysis could be see resource allocation and efficiency assessment in terms of the donors, because both for the World Bank even and the other donor agencies, those who are trying to distribute the limited resources they have within the context of upcoming 2030 agenda, they might look at how global goals stand for and how individual countries are putting efforts to achieving them, and given the frontier approach to say that there must be some fairness in terms of assessing effectiveness individual countries or project managers are putting for obtaining objectives of their individual projects. So in that respect, from the onset when I tried to use the DEA, I thought it should have a potential for being used in international organization. But as Marion said, here there is this problem in terms of politics. Whether it's for the politicians to decide which analytical approach to apply, or it's for the analysts to be in a position to sensitize policymakers to take the approach they are advocating. And I think perhaps that's one of the biggest challenges that I myself had when I was trying to represent it in DI law, that for some, the outcome, the ranking or efficiency comparison in itself has a seed of politics. So that's why it's not always welcome by certain politicians. But nonetheless, given the upcoming agenda, as the organizations will be in need of, they will have to evaluate the performance they are making towards the achievement of sustainable development goals. I think within that context, it's very timely and can be really applied. So by saying that, I would like to thank my both discussants